All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something I think is really important,
Yeah.
for everyone, really, when we talk about education and especially when we talk about
Right.
supporting students who maybe are facing some extra challenges, and making sure that everyone has a chance to really thrive.
Exactly.
And that's where MTSS comes in, right?
Yeah.
Multi-tiered system of supports.
Yeah.
And to help us kind of unpack all this, we've got a true expert here with us today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, MTSS is it's a big topic, obviously.
It is a big topic.
There's a lot to it, and for good reason.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is all about making sure students get what they need to be successful.
And so paint a picture for us.
Yeah.
When we say MTSS, like, what does that actually look like?
So I think a good way to think about it is like tiers or levels.
Okay.
So, you might think about it like levels in a video game.
Okay.
Where, tier 1 is like the base level. Yeah.
Where everybody starts. And that's where you've got high quality instruction.
Right.
You've got, good support for all students.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some students, they need a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that's where you move into tier 2.
Okay.
And those are more targeted interventions.
Okay.
And then, for some students, it's even more intensive.
Got it.
And that's where tier 3 comes in.
Okay. So it's kind of like I'm picturing like a pyramid almost.
Yeah.
With, a broad base. And then
exactly.
And then, as the needs get more intensive,
yeah,
it, kind of narrows up at the top.
That's a great way to think about it. Yep.
Okay, but how do educators decide like which tier a student needs?
Yeah, so that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And that's where the data piece comes in.
Okay.
Because it's really all about, using information and data to make those decisions.
So not just like, oh, that kid seems like they're struggling.
Let's bump them up a tier.
Yeah. You really want to use the data to drive those decisions.
So it's kind of like a mechanic, right? If you take your car into the shop, they don't just immediately start ripping out parts.
Yeah.
They kind of look around, they run some tests, they get some information before they decide what's wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
You want to gather the information. You want to make sure you're making good decisions based on what you're seeing from the student.
Okay.
Yeah.
So data is like our instruction manual almost
Yeah.
for how we help students
That's a great way to put it.
succeed.
Yeah.
And speaking of guidance, we've got this blog post by Dr. Howie Knoff.
Yes.
That really kind of got my wheels turning here.
Yeah, he's got some great stuff out there.
Yeah, because he talks about how even MTSS sometimes needs a little support itself, which is interesting.
It is.
And he uses this phrase that I gotta say it kind of caught me off guard.
Yeah.
Educational malpractice.
Yeah.
Like, is that even a real thing?
I know. Right? It's a really strong term.
It is.
And it's definitely, meant to make you kind of stop and think.
Yeah.
And to be clear, from a legal standpoint, there's no such thing as educational malpractice. It's not an actual legal term.
Okay.
But what Dr. Knoff is getting at here is really important, I think, which is that as educators, we have a huge responsibility to our students.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that we're doing right by them.
Absolutely.
And sometimes even with the best of intentions, we can fall short.
Yeah.
We can make mistakes.
Yeah.
And so he's really kind of using this term to highlight that.
Okay, so it's more of an ethical kind of red flag almost.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
As opposed to like...
It's not a legal threat.
Yeah.
It's more of an ethical wake-up call, I think.
Yeah.
He's really asking us to consider, the potential harm that could be done when we skip steps, when we don't have all the information, when we're not really thinking things through. And he even draws parallels to the medical field.
Okay.
He talks about, imagine if a doctor prescribed medication without, a proper diagnosis.
Yeah.
That would be...
That'd be bad.
A big problem.
Yeah.
And he's saying, in education, the stakes are high too.
Absolutely.
We're dealing with, people's lives, their futures, their well-being.
Their whole, educational journey.
Exactly. And so we need to treat that with the same level of care.
Wow. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Because it really does kind of make you think about all those times where, you've tried to solve a problem without having all the information.
Yeah.
Or all the pieces of the puzzle.
Yep.
And it usually doesn't end well.
It usually doesn't, no.
So what does Dr. Knoff suggest we do differently then?
So he proposes this idea, first things first.
First things first.
Which really just means, before you jump to conclusions, before you jump to interventions, you really need to gather a complete picture of what's going on with the student.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
First things first.
Yeah.
It's so simple, but I feel like it's so often overlooked.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
It's easy to just want to jump in and
Fix it.
Yeah, fix it.
Yeah.
But taking that time to really understand what's going on is so important.
Okay, so what are some of the key things that educators should be looking at first?
So he breaks it down into 6 activities.
6. Okay.
So the first one is all about digging into the student's history. Looking at their academic record, their attendance, any previous support they've received.
Right.
Even things like medical history or family history.
Yeah.
That might be relevant.
Interesting.
It's really about gathering all those clues.
Yeah, so it's like we're building a profile almost.
You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like being a detective, gathering all the evidence.
Okay, so we've got the backstory.
Yeah. And then the second activity is really focused on where the student is now.
Okay.
What are their strengths? What are they struggling with?
Yeah.
What specific skills are they missing?
Okay.
This is where you're going to assess their current academic and behavioral level.
So we've got like the backstory and the present situation.
Yeah.
What's next?
All right. So the third activity is all about tapping into the wisdom of those who know the student best.
Okay.
So this means talking to parents, talking to past teachers.
Right.
Depending on the situation, even talking to the student themselves.
Okay.
It's amazing what you can learn by just talking to the people who've been on the journey with the student.
So it's like crowdsourcing insights almost.
Yeah. Everyone's got a different piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And they can all share their perspectives and their insights.
And then the fourth activity.
All right. So the fourth activity kind of takes a step back.
Okay.
And looks at the bigger picture.
Okay.
And it asks, are there any other factors
interesting
that might be influencing the student struggles?
Got it.
So this could be things like health concerns, social emotional issues, even things happening at home that are impacting their ability to learn.
Yeah, it really does take a village.
It does. It really does.
Yeah, it's
sometimes it's not just what's happening in the classroom. There's all these other factors that are at play.
Okay, so then what's number 5?
So this is where things get really interesting, I think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Because this is where we flip the script.
Ooh, okay.
And we put the student at the center.
Okay, I'm all about student voice. Tell me more.
Yeah, so this step is all about getting the student's own perspective.
Okay.
What do they think their strengths and weaknesses are?
Right.
What do they find challenging?
Yeah.
What are their goals?
Right.
It's about giving them a voice in the process.
I love that because I feel like so often we try to fix things for students without really even understanding what they want or need.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
Yeah.
We think we know what's best.
Right.
But sometimes we're wrong.
Yeah, and sometimes the student has a completely different perspective.
They do. And that's really valuable information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked to the student. We've gotten their perspective. What's number 6?
All right, so the 6th activity involves actually observing the student in action.
Okay.
So, how do they behave in class? How do they interact with the teacher?
Yeah.
How do they interact with their peers?
Right.
What patterns do you see?
Okay.
Sometimes seeing is believing, and observation can reveal insights that you might miss otherwise.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's like we're putting together a puzzle. Right. We're gathering all these pieces of information from all these different sources.
From all these different sources, exactly.
Just want to get that full picture of the student.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And I can see how skipping this first things first could really lead to some misguided decisions.
It absolutely could. Yeah. It would be like a doctor treating a symptom without addressing the underlying cause.
Right.
You might be putting a Band-Aid on something.
Right, exactly.
That needs much more attention.
Yeah, and Dr. Knopf actually shares this really interesting case study in his post that kind of illustrates this perfectly.
Yep.
And it's about this 8th grade girl who, on the surface, seems to be doing pretty well academically.
Right.
Good grades.
Good grades, enrolled in advanced classes.
Advanced classes.
Yeah.
But there are some cracks beneath the surface.
There are, yeah.
You know, she's missing assignments.
Right.
She's struggling with anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are these hints of potential learning gaps.
Yeah, it's like that classic, you know, more than meets the eye.
More than meets the eye, exactly.
Situation.
Yeah. So imagine if educators had just, you know, focused on the anxiety.
Yeah.
And assumed it was just, you know,
right.
the pressure of those advanced classes. They might have just pulled her out.
Yeah, you could see that happening.
Thinking they're doing her a favor.
Right.
But without going through this first things first, they would miss some key information.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I'm hooked now. What kind of information are we talking about?
So when they dug deeper into her history, they discovered gaps in her records.
Okay.
You know, there was missing information from previous grades.
Wow.
There were unanswered questions about potential past diagnoses.
Interesting.
And there was a lack of clear communication with her parents.
Wow, so like key pieces of the puzzle.
Huge pieces of the puzzle that could have really impacted her current struggles.
Wow, that's a game changer.
It is. It really highlights how important it is to have that complete picture before you make any decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, but even with first things first, MTSS is still a pretty complex system.
It is. It is.
And Dr. Knoff mentions these 14 guiding principles for effective implementation.
Yeah, there's a lot to it.
It just seems like a lot to juggle.
It is. It's a lot to think about,
So let's maybe zoom in on a few of those principles that you think are particularly important.
Yeah.
Like, what are the non-negotiables?
Yeah, so I think, you know, principle 1 is really foundational.
Okay.
And it basically says that, you know, student success happens because of the characteristics and the actions and the interactions and the activities within the instructional environment.
So the classroom environment really matters.
Yeah, it's the foundation. You know, you can have all the interventions in the world, but if the classroom itself isn't conducive to learning, it's not going to matter.
It's like trying to grow a plant in bad soil.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how much water you give it.
Exactly.
If the foundation isn't right,
it's not going to thrive.
It's not going to thrive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so that's principle 1.
Principle 1, got it.
Another one that's really important is principle 4.
Okay.
And that one talks about the importance of a positive, safe, and supportive school environment.
The whole school climate matters.
The whole school climate matters.
Not just the individual classroom.
Yeah, you know, it really does take a village.
Yeah, you can't just have one supportive classroom and then the rest of the school is, you know, not...
It needs to be a school-wide effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what about principle 7?
So principle 7 is all about and using evidence to guide our choices.
It helps us see what's working, what's not.
It does. It helps us make adjustments.
Where we need to make adjustments,
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm also wondering, with all this emphasis on data and interventions, is there a risk of like losing sight of the human element?
That's a really good question. And it brings us back to that idea of educational malpractice. Right. You know, while we need systems and structures, it's so important to remember that we're working with individual human beings, each with their own unique needs and experiences. And that's where first things first is so valuable because it helps us ground our decisions in a deep understanding of that individual student.
So data informs, but it doesn't dictate.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. We still need that human touch.
We do.
That empathy and understanding.
Exactly.
Really guide our actions.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where you're using data wisely, but also remembering that behind every data point is a child, a learner.
A human being.
A human being, exactly.
Yeah, and that brings us back to Dr. Knoff's really thought-provoking question. Of like, when do well-intentioned mistakes cross the line into something more serious?
Yeah, when does it become something more than just a mistake?
Yeah.
That's a tough question.
What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's a really nuanced issue. You know, it's not always black and white. But I think one way to approach it is to ask ourselves a few key questions. So the first question is, was there a clear violation of professional standards or protocols?
So not just like a simple oversight, but like...
Yeah, it has to be more than that.
Okay.
You know, did the educator completely disregard something like the first things first process when it was clearly warranted, or maybe they ignored clear warning signs about a student's struggles, that's a big red flag.
Okay.
The second question is, did that violation directly result in harm to the student?
So it's not just about making a mistake.
Right.
It's about the impact.
It's about the impact of that mistake.
That mistake. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Did their actions or inaction actually have negative consequences for the student's learning or well-being?
Okay.
And then the third question is, were they negligent in their actions?
Got it.
Did they act or fail to act in a way that a reasonable and competent educator would not have?
Those are some really tough questions.
They are.
It kind of makes you realize that educators have a lot of power.
We do.
And with that power comes a lot of responsibility.
A lot of responsibility, yeah. We really have to be mindful of the impact of our decisions on our students.
So it's less about blame and more about continuous improvement.
I think that's a good way to frame it.
Yeah.
It's about striving to do better for our students.
Absolutely.
And I think part of that improvement involves advocating for systems that really support both students and educators.
Right.
We need to make sure that educators have the resources, the training, the support that they need to implement MTSS effectively.
Because the system's only as good as the people implementing it.
Yeah, if educators are feeling overwhelmed or unsupported.
Or burnt out.
Yeah. It's going to be hard for them to do their best work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's about creating that culture.
It is.
Of collaboration.
And support.
Yeah, where everyone's working together to help students succeed.
And that includes involving students in the process.
Absolutely, giving them a voice.
Empowering them.
To take ownership of their learning.
And that makes me think back to that 8th grade girl in the case study. Even though we don't know the ultimate outcome. I'm hoping that
I hope so too.
By using this first things first process, that educators were able to get her the support she needed.
Yeah, and that's really the power of MTSS. When it's done well. It's about creating a safety net for students, catching them before they fall through the cracks. But it all starts with that commitment to understanding the whole student.
Not just the problem we see on the surface.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening. I'm glad to hear that.
Deep dive.
Good.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of MTSS now.
Excellent.
And first things first.
Yeah.
And the,
the complexities.
The complexities of educator responsibility.
It's not easy work.
It's not easy work.
It's important work.
It is important work. And I hope it inspires our listeners to kind of continue exploring these ideas.
Keep learning.
And advocating for systems that really support every student.
That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On the Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'd love to hear from you, our listeners.
Yeah.
What resonated with you, what questions you still have. Share your insights on our website or social media.
Yeah.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it's like if you go to the doctor and you've got a headache and they just give you painkillers, but they don't actually figure out what's causing the headache.
Yeah, what's causing it.
Right. You're not really solving the problem.
Right. You're just masking the symptoms.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so in this case, if they had just focused on her anxiety and said, oh, well, she's in these advanced classes.
Right.
Maybe that's too much pressure.
Right.
Let's pull her out.
Let's just pull her out. Yeah.
That might have seemed like the right solution at the time.
Yeah.
But without that deeper dive, they might have missed some really important information.
Okay. So spill the tea. What did they miss?
Well, when they looked back at her records, they realized there were gaps. Missing information from previous grades.
Huh.
There were some unanswered questions about potential past diagnoses.
Interesting.
And there was a lack of communication with her parents.
So it was like they had this whole backstory.
They had this whole other part of her story that they were missing.
That they were totally missing. Wow.
Yeah, and those pieces could have really changed the way they approached supporting her.
Wow, that's a good point.
Yeah, so it really highlights the need for that comprehensive approach.
First things first.
First things first, exactly.
Okay, so but even with first things first.
Right.
MTSS is still a pretty complex system.
Yeah, there's a lot to it.
And Dr. Knoff mentions
he does
these 14 guiding principles for effective implementation.
It can feel overwhelming.
It does. It feels like a lot to juggle.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep in mind.
So let's maybe zoom in on a few of those principles that you think are especially important.
Okay.
What are the non-negotiables?
Well, I think principle 1 is a good place to start.
Okay, principle 1.
Yeah, that one's really foundational.
Okay.
And it basically says that student success, happens because of the characteristics of the learning environment.
Yeah.
The actions, the interactions, the activities.
The classroom environment really matters.
It really matters. It's the foundation.
Yeah.
Like you were saying before about the soil.
Right.
It doesn't matter what else you do if that foundation isn't there.
If the foundation's not there.
Yeah, the student's not going to thrive.
Got it.
So principle 1, super important.
Okay, principle 1, check.
And then another one that I think is really key is principle 4.
Okay, principle 4.
And this one talks about the importance of a positive and safe and supportive school environment.
The whole school climate.
The whole school climate, not just the individual classroom.
Yeah, like it really does take a village.
It really does.
Yeah.
You can't just have one supportive classroom and then the rest of the school is not.
Yeah.
It needs to be a school-wide
effort
for support.
Culture of support, exactly. Okay, what about principle 7?
So principle 7 highlights the importance of data-driven decision-making.
I love data.
Data is our friend.
Yeah.
It really helps us make good decisions.
See what's working, what's not.
Exactly.
And make adjustments as needed.
Yep. It takes the guesswork out of it. Yeah.
Okay, I like it.
So you're moving away from just relying on your gut.
Right.
And you're really using evidence to make those choices.
Okay, but I'm also wondering, with all this emphasis on data and interventions, is there a risk of kind of like
I know what you're
losing sight of the human element?
Yeah, a good point.
In all of this.
It's a really good point. And it brings us back to that idea of educational malpractice.
Okay, yeah.
Because yes, we need systems. Right. We need structures.
We need data.
Yeah. But we can't forget that we're working with people.
With real people,
With real people.
Yeah.
Each student is an individual with their own needs and experiences.
Yeah.
And that's why first things first is so important.
Right, because it's about understanding that individual.
It is. It's about getting to know the whole child.
So data informs, but it doesn't dictate.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use the data to guide us.
Right.
But we always have to remember that human element.
That human touch.
That empathy, that understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance, that sweet spot.
Between the data and the...
Yeah, between the data and the human.
Okay.
So you're using the data wisely, but you're never forgetting that behind every data point is a child.
A child, yeah.
A learner, a human being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to Dr. Knoff's really thought-provoking question of when do well-intentioned mistakes cross the line into something more serious?
Yeah, like where do we draw that line? Yeah. When does it become more than just a mistake? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a tough one. You know, it's not always so clear-cut.
Right.
But I think a good starting point is to ask ourselves some questions.
Okay, yeah, like what kind of questions?
So first, did the educator, do they clearly violate any professional standards or protocols?
So not just like a...
Right, not just a simple oversight.
Well, let's see.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah. Like, did they completely ignore something like first things first?
Yeah.
When it was, obviously needed.
Right, when it was like...
Right, like it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, the clear next step.
Exactly. Yeah. Or maybe they ignored, some really obvious warning signs.
Okay.
About a student who was struggling.
Right, yeah. Like red flags.
Big red flags.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the first question. Okay, so first question, check.
And then the second question is, did that violation, did it actually lead to harm for the student?
So it's not just about making a mistake.
Right. It's about the impact.
It's about the consequences.
Exactly.
Okay.
So did their actions or even their inaction, did that have a negative impact on the student's learning or their well-being?
Okay, so second question, impact. Got it.
And then the third question is about negligence.
Okay.
So did the educator, You know, do they do something or not do something that a reasonable and competent educator would not have done?
Okay, so it's like comparing it to kind of like the standard of care almost.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are the 3 questions.
Oh, those are...
They're tough questions.
They're tough, yeah.
And it really makes you think about, you know, the weight of our decision.
It does. Like, wow,
we have a lot of power.
We have a lot of power as educators.
As educators, yeah.
And a lot of responsibility.
And a lot of responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah.
We really have to be mindful of how our actions impact
our students.
Our students.
Yeah. Okay, so it's less about blame then.
I think so.
And more about
continuous improvement.
Striving to do better?
Yeah, striving to do better.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is advocating for systems that really support both students and educators.
Right, because it's not just about supporting students.
We have to support the adults, too.
You got to support the teachers, the staff.
Everyone, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, making sure educators have the resources, the training, the support that they need to do this work well.
Because like we said, a system is only as good as the people implementing it.
You can have the best system in the world.
Right.
But if the people using it
aren't feeling supported
or equipped
or trained. Yeah, it's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
So it's about creating that culture of collaboration, of support.
Yeah, where everyone's on the same team.
Everyone's on the same team.
Working together.
Yeah. Toward that common goal.
And that includes
students.
Students, right?
Bringing students into the process.
Yeah, giving them a voice.
Empowering them to be part of the solution.
Yeah, and that takes me back to that 8th grade girl.
Yeah.
In the case study.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't know how her story ended.
We don't.
But I'm really hoping that...
I hope so, too.
By using first things first.
Yeah.
That they were able to, you know, get her the support that she needed.
Yeah, and that's what MTSS is all about.
Okay.
You know, when it's done well, it's about creating that safety net for students.
Right.
Catching them before they fall through the cracks.
Yeah, and it all starts with that commitment.
It does.
To understanding the whole student.
The whole student, yeah.
Yeah, not just the problem that we...
Not the surface level stuff.
See on the surface.
Right, we got to dig deeper.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
I'm glad to hear it.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of MTSS and first things first.
Yeah.
And just the whole idea of, you know, educator responsibility.
Yeah. It's a big topic.
It's a big topic.
But it's an important one.
It's an important one.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners out there
I hope so too.
Are feeling inspired to, you know, to continue learning about this.
Keep learning.
To advocate for systems that support students and to really just, you know,
do the best we can.
Do the best we can for our kids.
For our kids, that's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On the Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'd love to hear from you, our listeners.
Yeah.
What resonated with you, what questions you still have. Share your thoughts on our website, on social media.
Yep.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Let's do it.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.